to wrap things up, I'm going to start this section talking about some crop examples. Hopefully my colleagues here will chime in. And then for about a half an hour, and then Jared's going to talk about some varietal maintenance and the issues around that for maybe 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes at the end for some discussion and final questions. So anyway, so I'm just going to run through a few of, most of the basic crop types, just kind of summarizing a few things that we touched on in the earlier sections, and adding a few little twists that we haven't covered. I'm in Central California, and which is a place that we can grow really good biennial seed, all the biennial crops there, because of the climate is conducive for that. So I've been concentrating on those crops. And I know some of you here in the Pacific Northwest also have climates for biennials, but a lot of people don't like to mess with them because it takes 2 years to finish it out, or 2 seasons anyway. And it, the winter time can pose some challenges for some of the crops. So I'm going to start with onions. And this photo is, okay, this is actually the second year. So previous to this, the year before, we grew the onions as a fresh crop, grew it as a bulb crop. And for the storage onions, which is most of what we're talking about, and I'll talk about the non-storage ones a little too, but for storage onions, that first season, we grow the onions through the year as a normal fresh crop, and then get our bulbs in the fall, harvest them, and now we've got the opportunity to select the ones that we want to keep for the next season. So this is, that's the beauty of these biennials. We can really make the selection and choose what we want. And for storage onions, as I mentioned earlier, we want to have long storage, and so it means we want to have those onions that have nice tight neck closure. So they'll keep for 4 to 6 months. Well, I've got onions now that I grew this past year that are in storage, and I'm waiting to plant them out in the spring. Ideally, there's kind of 2 areas where onions store really well. One is at about 34 degrees, which is a hard temperature, and sort of a medium relative humidity, which is kind of hard for a lot of people to achieve. I happen to have the good fortune of working with a grower who's got a climate-controlled storage, so I've got the onions in his storage facility. If you don't have that, you can also store onions above 60 degrees, sort of what I call cool room temperature, which will maintain a pretty good storage for at least 4 to 6 months. What you don't want is a temperature around 40 to 50 degrees, because they think after a little while that it's springtime and they want to sprout. And the same is true with garlic. So if you're storing them, store them in a cool room temperature in netted bags. So then you come out the next spring and you're planting the onions, bulbs, and you want to space them probably a foot apart or so, because each of these onions is going to send up an umbel. You might be able to squeeze it a little bit depending on how wide your rows are, but you want to be able to allow enough space so the onion umbel can form properly. So this onion crop we're seeing here, we're seeing like the seed is developing. You can see, if you say this umbel right here, you can tell there's green seed in here. And then, but there's still a lot of open flowers too. And this is an insect pollinated crop. And as somebody mentioned, a lot of insects don't like onions very much. And so I think what I've seen is that it's important to make sure you've got robust pollinators, like a good mixed community of pollinators around. And you might want to bring hives in, although we've had plenty of success with feral bees and other wild species. But I think that's one of the things you want to pay attention to are the pollinators. And onions are a little tricky that way because if it gets too hot or too cold, the insects don't pollinate them at all. And you can end up, if it's like weeks of rainy weather during the pollination, and you end up with blanks. There's nothing in there, and that can be pretty discouraging. So it's really important, I think, and adding insectary rows, Phacelia, like California bluebell is one that's very effective. There are other ones, insectary hedgerows that can be very important when you're growing onions. Then, okay.
Steve, a quick
Yeah,
question.
sure.
Back to the storage. Did I hear you right saying at either 34 degrees or around 60 degrees, but nothing in between?
Right, nothing. Yeah, above 60. I don't know what you might have, Jared, to comment on that. But
it's springtime when it's 60.
well, apparently it's too warm. It stays dormant. It's in that bulb stage. It's in a dormant state, and I don't know exactly. I think it's a timing where there's sort of a built-in timer, and the variety will start to send up a little stalk.
Do you want a certain kind of humidity at that 60 degrees?
Well, I said just kind of a average. I mean, not. I think it can be fairly flexible, but I think probably a little bit on the drier side. I mean, when you think about it's like garlic too. I think the two of them are similar in their storage ability. Let's see. Okay, now on this slide here, we've got right here. This one, you can start to see little black seeds emerging here. So like the little capsule starts opening up, and the seeds are jet black. And really, this one, that particular umbel is just about ready to cut. Now, we talked about don't water. I didn't even see until I blew this photo up that he's still watering in this field. Probably want to cut the water here. We're probably like, we're done with the water. As soon as you start seeing these first umbels opening up. But then you would come in and clip them by hand. And I think at a big scale, you'd have to wait till like enough of the seed heads were open, and then just cut just harvest 75%, because you're going to lose them at a bigger scale. If you're able to go in and cut individually, you can probably get almost all the seed. Anyway, and then that picture I showed of your hands, through the hand screen, that would be the next thing after cutting it. So we can then go through the process of cleaning, either with like screens and fans. Well, after that initial rough threshing, we still have a lot of material to deal with. So another way to deal with that, other than trying to do it with fans and screens, is to float the debris, in water. So here we go. We've got this bucket of water, and the seed is down, it sinks to the bottom, and all that light duff material floats to the top. And so here they are pouring off this material, all this light material here, and then a final rinse, and then spreading it out with a fan going, and get it spread out thin on a screen, and then dry it immediately. But even after that, you still have a little bit of material to deal with at the end. But it gets about 90% of it. Now, you can only do that once. You can't go back and say, oh, let me float it again. No. Then it's already imbibed as much water as it can take. You can destroy the seed. Yes?
What other dry seed crops have you used that method with?
None. That's the only one that I've ever used it on. Have you guys, anybody, any experience? Yeah.
Can you use some kind of liquid that they don't take up?
Huh, that's a good question. The question is, can you use another thing besides water? I can't think of any other liquid that you could
Yeah,
use.
that you'd want on your seeds.
Yeah, I think, probably not. But anyway,
I know someone who does lettuce that way.
Chuck?
Chuck.
I thought he was crazy when he said that's the
He says he germ tests it,
huh,
He's
yeah.
been doing it long enough where, he says it works perfect, so.
Interesting.
I know a farmer in Vermont that does it with grains.
Grain?
Okay. So there are some other examples. This is the only one I've ever done it to, but okay. So that's a little bit with the onion, carrot. The other biennial another biennial I'm working with a lot, and Jared mentioned the term steckling, and those are really just carrot roots that you're selecting to replant. So what we would do here is after the season, it's so typically in this climate we plant them in midsummer, and then you get the roots. You want kind of a mid-sized root. You don't want it to be over mature, and you don't want it to be too small, but like a mid-sized root that you can harvest, and then so you can lay them out here and decide which ones you want to keep to replant. And most of these look pretty good, but maybe if you're going for the ones that have a more blunted tip, for example, if this is a nonce carrot, maybe that's what you want to select for. Ones that have twists and sort of look ugly, as we say, kick out the uglies. Maybe you're not sure if it's an environmental reason or a genetic reason for that deformity. But anyway, you have the ability. If you have enough roots, you have the luxury of selecting the ones you want. And so before you put them into storage, you want to trim the tops maybe about a ½ an inch above the top of the root. And then, now storage of carrots, with these, you can either pull them out of the ground in the fall and then find a storage unit you need about 34 degrees, like onion, but much, much more humid, like 90 to 95% humidity, so like a root cellar. But that's a lot of work, and you're probably going to lose a bunch of the roots in storage. But again, if you do, you're selecting for the strongest stored roots to replant out, so that's a good thing. But another way to do it, and we have that, in California we've done it that way, and you can do it here in Oregon, although you guys have Queen Anne's lace, so unless you're on the east side, I wouldn't recommend carrots. But I'm leaving my carrots in the ground all winter long. And so then in another few weeks, I'm going to go and pull them all and lay them out, and then I'll do my selection right there in the field, and I have a plot right next to it, and I'm just going to move my roots, the ones I want, back into the ground. I'm probably going to give them about a foot spacing. Yeah?
What are you looking for?
Well, generally, usually with something like carrots, it's nice form. You don't want to see a lot of, you want to see smooth roots, good color. Flavor, you could actually do flavor, although people do that when they really get into really get obsessed about things. But, but basically you're just looking for good characteristics that, people would appreciate when they see a bunching carrot in this case. So,
You can look for strong tops too, strong top connection.
Right.
Exactly.
Whenever
you you know, whatever you don't like about your carrots, you're selecting the opposite.
Right, with a bunching carrot, it would be a strong top, so when you're pulling them out of the ground, the tops don't break on you. And, yeah,
That seems like another good reason to get a good seed stock, like one you trust maybe the flavor of, and then you don't have to do the taste testing.
right, because flavor's a tough one. You can do it, and I've heard people do it, but yeah, it's nice to have at least a carrot that you like, so you don't have to do, like, reinvent the wheel on this. You know, you want to start with a good thing. Yes, okay, now, if you can't leave it in the ground, the question is, if you have to pull it out of the ground, and by the way, one of the hazards of leaving it in the ground is predation by gophers, which I've seen. I've lost entire crops to gophers by leaving the crop in the ground. And so it is, in some ways, it really behooves you to pull the roots. One way you can do it is you can take those 25-pound, they call them cello bags, or like these plastic bags with strips with like slits in them, so there's air movement, and you can spread like small wood chips around it, so it maintains moisture in there, but not too wet. You don't want it to be so wet that it's just going to rot on you. So, and then you need to find some kind of a cold storage. But again, if you get above, like onions, if you get above 40 degrees, they want to sprout. So it's got to be cold enough to stay dormant. You know, otherwise it's going to sprout, and it's going to want to grow right then because it thinks it's spring. Yeah.
Is there any, can it get too cold?
Yes, you can freeze the carrot and then you kill it. Yep. You definitely don't want it below 32 degrees. And the other advantage of putting them in a cooler as opposed to leaving them in the ground is, as Jared mentioned earlier, in warmer climates you might not get enough vernalization. So the things you get incomplete bolting the second year, which you don't want. So putting them in this cold room for 3 or 4 months assures that you're going to get the needed vernalization. Yeah. Well, yeah, go ahead, Jared.
So, yeah, I mean, you can do it both ways, and people do it both ways in terms of doing your selection and replanting in, you know, the fall versus the spring. One advantage to doing it in the spring is now so say you do it in the fall, and you've gone through and put all this effort into selecting your most beautiful carrots, and then they still have the chance to go for munch, rot, not vernalize, you know. I mean, I guess the not vernalizing would happen anyways, but basically at least in terms of some of all the problems that those carrots are going to suffer through in the winter, by the time spring comes around, you're not dealing with anything that didn't make it.
So here's just showing staking, which is kind of important a lot for carrots because they do tend to flop over. And just an added benefit of carrots and all the Apiaceae, cilantro, parsnips, fennel, all of them are wonderful insectary plants. I mean, yeah, virtually everything loves carrots, you know, so just gauging the harvest. And then here's a crop that actually is ready. You know, this is ready to go because it's now totally browned down on the top. There's still green underneath. And you are starting to see a little shattering. Carrots do shatter a little bit. And I just like this shot, the seed ball. You know, and so carrots have they cling to one another. So when you're actually processing carrots, you want to lay them out in a one layer, so you can actually work those pieces so they don't all cling together. Okay, I'm running out of time here. So, and then beets is similar to carrots. I'll just go through this really fast. Again, you do the same kind of selection. Beet flowers during the second year. And there's the crop ready to harvest. And I just got to show you this photo here, because this plant, that's one plant there. Here's the beet root right here. That's a little cylindrical beet, about this big when you eat it. Well, the beet was probably 16 inches long. And that one plant produced, produced clean seed over 30,000 seeds, 3/4 of a pound. That's the kind of, if you're in the right climate, that's the kind of yields you can achieve with this stuff, yeah. And then you do that rough scalping, you know, like as I said, I've got those screens that I had out there. You strip plants, rough scalp, and then bring it in and get that field moisture off of them. And then, but you've got this problem, what Jared was mentioning, you know, this hairy vetch, I ended up having to pick this stuff out. So just don't let hairy vetch get into your seed crop. It's really tough. So, and then, you know, the sticks. And then I did a final sieving, so I'm actually sizing it so the smallest seed falls down through this precision screen. So this is the good seed on top. Yes, and the same thing, yeah, with the beet, yeah, you trim the top again like carrot. But interesting, like carrot, you can cut off the bottom section of the root and it'll still grow. Beet, you actually have to maintain that bottom part. So if you actually want to look at the interior, like say a Chioggia beet that's striped and you want to select for good striping, you actually need to cut a wedge on the side of the beet. You have to maintain the bottom of the root. What?
It won't harm it for replanting.
No, if you just cut a wedge out, but you can't cut it horizontally on the bottom. And then of course, this is the hairy vetch. This is the last resort. Don't get to this point. And then broccoli, long harvest window. This is an annual, but you know, the biennials. Cabbage is a little tougher because it goes through 2 seasons. But I'm just going to talk about broccoli quickly. There it is, almost there. You can see it's still kind of green. It's not quite ready. This needs a buff color. It's still a little bit green. And then, okay, then once you get that buff color, then you cut it. Here it is, you know, like cutting it. I used to pull them by the roots, and what Jared was saying, you end up getting dirt and stones in there, and it is a horror show. So you'd want to avoid that.
Cool. Can I just jump in real quick?
Yeah.
So one thing to watch out for if you're windrowing on a plastic tarp like that, rather than on either, you know, something breathable like breathable ground cloth or remay, or just directly on the ground, you got to watch out for condensation, right? Because what's happening, the seeds on the top, if these plants aren't fully dried down, and they're probably not because you're windrowing them, the top half is getting the sun, it's drying. Underneath is where you've got, you know, your moist, you know, not as dried material, and that's coming right in contact with some plastic. And so if you're doing this, you're going to want to be rotating that regularly.
Right. Well, fortunately, I didn't leave them on the windrows. This was only like a step that I had in there for like an afternoon because I brought them inside a greenhouse to finish out the climate. But that's right. So I wasn't trying to finish dry them in the field. So I brought them in and just sort of propped them up inside a greenhouse and actually let them dry down for like another 2 weeks. You know, so I really got the crispy, dry seed heads. And then I was able, with my high-tech cleaning facility in my backyard, you know, with my screens and fans, strip the broccoli plants and then work it. And then a final, what I call final scalping. So some of these pods that were left, they got eliminated. So there's a small precision screen, little hand screen, where the seed falls through there. Then a final winnowing, and then just some finishing touches. You know, and you often get a little dust left. I didn't have a lot of precision screens, and I could have taken a tiny precision screen to eliminate the dust and leave the good seed on the top. Okay. Cauliflower, just a word about that. If you ever do cauliflower seed, it's amazing what the pros do. They cut out about 90% of the head to encourage shoots. That's how you get a good cauliflower seed. You don't let the head stay intact. Garbanzos, crop I've gotten kind of fond of. And here's another bean with another high-tech piece of equipment. undercutting beans to like cut them just as they're drying. And so then you're basically windrowing them to finish the drying. And then here's back to the garbanzos again. This is ready to thresh, and then dance delicately. So the technique is like this, not like not stomping on it. That's the way you break seed up. So it's actually kind of a movement sideways, and you can get them pretty clean without any splits in it this way. And, well, this is my mother-in-law holding her. She's just turned 100. And so she is one of the 2 heirlooms in this picture. But I call this exploiting senior citizens. Because, she didn't have a lot to do, and I needed her to pick out those broken beans that I drove the tractor on. So hence we got this picture. But she was game, so. So if you have a 100-year-old relative, put her to use. And I want to say something quick about squash. That note the wide spacing gives because we're really going for maximum seed yield per plant, and this is also a dry farm situation, which that's talk for another day. Here's ripening fruit. And here's ripened fruit up on a wagon, and then you really cure this for up to 3 months. You don't immediately take it off. And we use actually like a log splitter. This is a winter squash here, but we use a log splitter to cut open the fruit. And actually, if you're lucky with winter squash, you can find a food bank that'll take the food. 'Cause summer squash, there's not really food value with a big thing, but the winter squash, there is. Mixing it up with the pulp and seed, and Jared already talked about this, the seed sluice, and then the final rinse. And then with pepper, I just want to say there's another piece of equipment that we hadn't mentioned before, and that's the Millet Wet Separator, a great little unit which has this is a hopper right here, little chopper blades in here to chop up the fruit. And so then here you're separating the seed from the fruit, so the seed falls down through the screen, and then we use the sluice again, same thing. So you have a salsa party over here, like with all this, and then the seed drops into here, and then down the sluice, and clean it the same way you would with squash, and then finally sun-dried seed. So that's where I'm going to stop.
And you would winnow it after.
Yes,
Right.
You would winnow it after that, exactly.
I'm gonna do Solanaceae. Those are some red peppers we did this year. So, as you all probably know, we're talking tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. We talked about isolation already. We talked about, maturity with all these crops. You really want them fully mature. A really interesting thing, especially with tomatoes, but really with peppers and eggplant too, is that the yields for these crops is across the board, So I can grow a 100-foot row of, a big pink heirloom tomato and get 1.5 pounds of seed, or I can grow, Matt's wild cherry and get 8 pounds of seed. And I did a good job on both of them, and so, 2.5, 3 pounds of seed is average, some are going to make 5, some are going to make less than 2. So it's really tough, especially if you're a contract grower and somebody calls you and says, hey, I've got this tomato, you want to grow it for seed? It's like, well, what do I charge them? Is it going to make 2 pounds? Is it going to make 10 pounds? I really just need to make the same amount of money on either one. But, so just know that there's a huge variability. And tomatoes is maybe an extreme, but really with all the seed crops and all the varieties, within the varieties you're going to have a big range of yields. Can you guys think of another species that has such a big range?
Well, as I said, onions, yeah. onions, onions, a lot of times you have a total crop failure. At least with tomatoes, there's some assurance of a yield. But no, that's probably about, tomatoes is probably, I would say, is the extreme for range. Another crop that really has a big range is cucumbers. And it really depends on the kind of cucumber it is. Like those Marketmore cucumbers, the standard American slicer, is a pretty heavy yielder. But a lot like those Asian cucumbers, those long, slender ones, hardly any seed in a lot of them. So if you have a contract with someone and it's cucumbers, grow the crop first. Find out about the seed yields on them before you sign on the dotted line that you agree to a certain price. Because you could really lose your shirt if it's something that you just get no seed on.
The other thing you can ask is ask the seed company if they're willing to put you in touch with the last person that grew that crop for them and have a conversation. Why aren't you growing it anymore? How did it yield? What were the challenges that I should know?
Yeah, do your research. And most seed companies are great. You know, I've had low yielding varieties, and I call them. I'm like, I'm not making enough money on this, you know, and they're like, okay, well, here's a little more. So, yeah, good people out there. So I'm gonna just really quick take you through what I do on my tiny scale. This is just an old chipper shredder. Let's see if I can get this to work. There I am, and I'm just gonna dump that tub of tomatoes in there. And it just grinds them all up perfectly. And then I'm just gonna put that into this 50-gallon barrel, fill that up, and then, you know, however many I have of those, let them sit for those 2 to 3 days, let them ferment. But fastest way to grind up a bunch of tomatoes.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Do you dull the blades?
What's that?
Do you dull the blades?
No, I mean, yeah,
They're pretty small.
it's pretty hard to hurt them. Yeah. So, and then I don't really have. I'm not taking enough pictures, obviously. So, then those big barrels, let them ferment in there. Like Jared said, 2 days, stir them every day, twice a day. And then what I'll do is I'll take an empty one of those and I'll fill it up a third of the way. And then I fill up the balance with water. Because, you know, when you just do that, it's pretty thick. And so even if the gel has fermented off the seed, you know, the viscosity of the tomato pulp is still too thick for that seed to really sink to the bottom. So you've got to thin it out until that seed can actually move through all of that. So, and that's going to depend on the variety. So some are, you know, more watery and you need less water. Some are like really thick, so you need more water. So it's just a matter of paying attention to that variety and making sure you're adding enough water so that the seed can get down to the bottom. And then you guys saw the picture where, you know, you're just tipping over that whole barrel. You know, you're pouring out all that pulp and you're just looking really close so that when you see that big pile of gold at the bottom, you know, you stop and you don't pour it out. Pour more water in, repeat the process. So, you know, at one point you get it relatively clean. You know, big machines on big farms, they grind it up and they do a pre-screen, kind of like that millet that you saw. But it on a small scale, it's a pain in the butt because, you know, if you don't have the right screen and you don't have something that's cleaning the screen, it's going to just get clogged. And so I just skip that whole step. And what I do is, you know, once I've diluted it and decanted it a couple times, it's pretty clean. So I just lay out an 1/8-inch screen. I pour it on that, and then I pressure wash it, not with a pressure washer, but just with a hose. You know, I'm forcing the seed through the 1/8-inch screen. So all the stems from the tomato, you know, any big chunks that are left, because, you know, big chunks aren't gonna float and decant out. You know, I'm getting those out. You know, I'll decant it one more time, and most of you have probably figured out this little trick too. If you do have dirt in there, you can always do a reverse decant, right? So soil and rocks are heavier than seed. So fill it up with water, stir it up a little bit, get all those seeds up in the water, pour the seeds out with the water, all the rocks and the dirt will be at the bottom. So it's the same process, except you just flipped it out, the goal. And then, like we already said, I just, go to Habitat for Humanity, buy a bunch of window screens, spread it out in a 1/4 inch thick layer. I prop it up, put some box fans on it, and it's dry. You really want it to dry within a few hours. So, if you stir it up a little bit, I usually don't stir it up, and it's fine. I mean, it all depends how thick it is, so you just want it thin enough where you're going to come back 5 hours later and it's going to be pretty dry. And then you got this mat of tomato seed. So sometimes I'll rub it through an 1/8 inch screen because it's all just glued together to break it apart. It's still got lots of hairs. If you are going to run it through a clippers cleaner or something, sometimes I'll take, you kind of want to polish them a little bit. So that same drill that you saw somebody using, like the mortar mixer, you can just take the seed to that and that'll help polish it up a little bit. And then, if there's pieces of skin and, just tiny little things in there that you want to get out, hopefully sometimes it comes out clean the first time and you don't need to do that. But yeah, definitely put a fan on once it's drying. So peppers and eggplant, it's almost the same process except I don't do any fermentation. Some people do fermentation for peppers. I find that it's easier not to do the fermentation. I also slow down the grinder. So I throw it in the same grinder, throw the peppers in the same grinder, but I'm looking for bigger chunks of pepper, because the bigger the chunk, the easier it is to throw it and pour that mash that's coming out on a 1/4 inch screen, and then I'm doing the same process. I'm just spraying it with a hose and a little gun nozzle. And all the seeds go through, all the pulp and everything else stays on the top of the screen, so quickly and easily. Get to the heart of the matter, it's still this red juice with seeds, so you do have to decant and dilute it again one more time, and then it's the same process, and we just showed you the millet. But so this is water intensive, so, for every 50 gallons of tomato pulp that I'm going through, there's 100 gallons of water for the initial decanting, and then there's more water to rinse it through the screens and then decant it again. And probably at my scale I really need to build that sluice because that's going to be a lot easier, and then I don't have to tilt. So any more Solanaceae questions? Mine gets 2-3 hours of sun, and then mostly it's in the shade. Fruit flies, get some row cover all that stuff. And actually I pick my tomatoes in those yellow flats, and I pick them pretty ripe. I only pick every 2 weeks, sometimes a little bit more. So sometimes there's some pretty ripe fruits on those plants. But then I'll even let them sit in those yellow tubs for, 3 days before I grind them. So, they're not, I don't let them get total mush, and it's not disgusting anymore. You don't want like rotten stuff dripping out, but you want them really ripe. So some you plant in the fall, some you can plant in the spring. All depends on their vernalization requirements. It's a big family. We've got tons of varieties. They're all kind of unique, so you have to get to know them. They all have varying sensitivities to what that temperature is at the flowering point. But most of them like it, on the cooler side while they're flowering. If it's starting to get too hot during flowering, you're not going to get good seed set. It's insect pollinated, so you got to have your right isolation. Steve talked about maturity a lot. When it's getting close, I'm looking at it every day. I always feel like there's that perfect day. So I go over there, I look at it, and I'm like, today, no, tomorrow. Oh, it'll definitely be in 2 days. Oh, no, one more, and you've got these stalks, and they flowered from the bottom to the top, and and the bottom ones are going to be ripe, and the top ones are going to be immature. And what I kind of do is I go 3/4 of the way up that stalk, and I'll take a pod and I open the pod, and you can see the little row of seeds inside, and they start off green, and then they're going to start having these brown spots on them, and they're going to be slowly changing. So I really like to open that pod and really look in there. And if most of those seeds inside that pod have some brown spots on them, or maybe halfway, even 1/3 of the way, I'll be like, okay, that's good. Because if I wait longer, I have a lot of problem with Brassica shattering. So, if 3/4 of the way up, they're that far along, I know I can cut it at the bottom, put it on the tarp, let it finish ripening on the tarp, and I'll get great seed, great yields. One thing, when you do put it on the tarp, I like to put it in some partial shade. I feel like full sun in my climate will dry them too fast. They don't have time to really do that ripening process. When you cut the plant, it's still alive. You want to kind of extend that a little bit as much as possible. So I've got a north-south line of tall evergreen trees. So I put my tarp right up against the bottom of it if I can. So it doesn't get sun until 12:30 in the afternoon, and then just a little bit afternoon sun, which is fine, and it's worked out perfect. Well, I usually start harvesting, usually that 3/4 up the stalk, and when it's in that situation I just described, you haven't really started shattering at the bottom yet. So, I always lose some to shattering. And it might not be natural shattering, it's more going in there and cutting the plants and putting them on the tarp, just that process. And they're all grown together, so you kind of have to tease them apart a little bit. You're always going to have shattering. But that's okay, it's a little bit's worth it, for the overall yield that you're going to get.
And sometimes when you're thinking about minimizing shattering and harvest processes like that, you want to think about time of day. So you want to work when there's not necessarily at 3:30 in the afternoon when they're extra dry and brittle, but maybe more like 9 in the morning or something when some of the heaviest dew is come off of them, but they're still have a little bit of give to them, and then you'll get less shattering.
Yeah, we only harvest in the morning. Usually I don't need to rotate the brassica. It all depends on how thick the pile that you do is. So if you can spread it out thin enough, if I go that thick, I don't need to rotate it. If I went thicker than that, then I probably would. Lettuce, I have to be more careful of, because lettuce is still very green when you're cutting it. So if you put lettuce down and that thick, because it still has a bunch of leaves too. These brassica plants, they're just brown stems, so, but the lettuce still has green, fleshy leaves. So, sometimes, my lettuce plots are not that big, 15 pounds of seed. So I can just, pull out some scrap lumber or something, lay the 2x4s down on the tarp, and then, and then facing up, and then I'll lay the lettuce on that. So I've got, this 3.5 inches of airflow underneath, and that can help a lot, and then I don't have to bother with flipping. Brassica, maturity. So cut, windrow. For brassicas that have one big strong stem, some loppers, goes pretty quick. You can get through that pretty fast. Some of them send out lots of stems from the bottom. You'd be there for days with loppers. So I have like a still weed whacker that I put a hedge trimmer attachment on, and then just adjust it so that I can just walk along the row and just cut it, as if it was a sickle bar. And if you're doing it right and things aren't shattering, then you can just gently grab all of that after you've cut it and take it. And I don't like carrying stuff, so if where I want to put it is not close to where the crop is, then I've got a truck and a trailer. I just bring it up along the row, and then it's just put it in the trailer, drive it to where you want it, unload it, put it on the tarp. We already talked about, yeah, so then we thresh, scalp, finish, clean. Brassica is like the easiest. And then the aster family, here we're just talking about lettuce, chicory, endive, escarole. I'm missing another one.
Biggies.
So, you're waiting for your lettuce to ripen up. I like, what I do is the same thing. I'm always like going out there every day when it's almost that time, trying to pick that perfect day. And you look at those little branches, and each one has those little flowers. I'll look, and as long as 3 out of 5, are fully mature, then I'll cut it. If only 2 out of 5 have opened up, then I'm not gonna cut it. 3 out of 5, cut it. Birds, you have to watch out with birds with these guys. You can, they'll go for brassica too, but they love lettuce seed. And so here I have a trailer with a tarp. We're cutting it there in the field, putting it on the trailer, and then we're gonna go cure it somewhere else. And sometimes the birds will attack it while it's in the windrow. So every once in a while I'll put a row cover over it, and it'll still dry down. What else do I want to say? You can't emphasize what Jared said enough about dirt and rocks. Super hard to get out, so everything we do, we're, very conscious of where we're stepping, how clean our shoes are, minimize that as much as possible. So lettuce is a long season, especially varieties have a wide range of maturity, so, start early. We talked about isolation for those. Heading types. If you have butterhead or crisp head, you've got to help that seed stock get out. So, take a knife, cut an X in the top. Go ahead and just take one and dissect it. Get a sense of where that growing point is deep inside that head. And so that when you're out there opening all of these up, you're not getting down to that growing point. If you don't do that, it's going to try to grow, and it's not going to be able to, and then it's going to start rotting, and then it's going to be all deformed, and it's just going to be bad news. So you definitely have to help them out. The loose leaf is not a problem. Just talked about maturity. Yeah, cut, windrow, let finish. I told you I thresh them with a rototiller, screen, winnow. Sometimes they do have that little fluff on them, like the dandelion. Every once in a while, that doesn't break off in the threshing. And then when you're winnowing or something, or screening, it's, when that's still attached to the lettuce seed, it changes everything about, its aerodynamics, its size. So, sometimes it's nice to give it like a little bit of rub and make sure you've broken that thing off.
Show of hands for a quick overview of plant breeding. Looks like a little more on the plant breeding. Okay, so I will do that. I'm going to see if I can go quick enough. We can still have some time for questions. So when we're talking about mass selection, what we're talking about is we're talking about choosing individual plants, looking at a plant and saying, yes, your thumbs up, we like you, or no, thumbs down, we don't like you. And the trick with that is it becomes a little more challenging to know necessarily, is this individual plant really genetically better, or is it just happen to be grown in a better part of the field? Some things that you can do to improve your likelihood of success with mass selection is first the idea of, as much, and we mentioned this earlier, as much as possible, select before pollination. Because if you have traits that you care about, whether it's germination and early vigor, if it's plant type or leaf type, anything that you can observe before pollination, if you can remove the plants that you don't like before they contribute their pollen all over the place, you're going to be able to speed up your selection. You're going to be able to speed up your efforts compared to whatever you're doing after pollination. Something to keep in mind is some traits are what we call in the world of plant breeding more heritable than others. Some traits are really, regardless of the conditions of the environment, you'll probably be able to see them. So maybe something like, seed color in corn, or, leaf color in lettuce. These are, whether it was grown in a, poor soil or good soil, those colors are going to be pretty consistent. Those are things you don't have to worry as much about in terms of, am I making a mistake in choosing this? But other things like yield and vigor are things that are going to be much more affected by the specific environment they're grown in. Another way, besides selecting before pollination, that you can improve your chances of actually moving forward and improving your variety is the bigger the population you can grow and do a good job of growing. In other words, the more plants you can start with, the better off you are. If you can start with 1,000 plants and end up with picking only the best 50 of those 1,000, you can make a lot more progress than if you started with 75 and narrowed it down to 50. You've got a lot more chances to find really, off the scale superior plants if you grow a bigger population. I talked about the uniform conditions. One strategy to kind of address if you don't have perfect uniformity in your field is you can, rather than trying to just find the best plants in the field, you can draw some imaginary lines and divide up your field and try and select evenly from different patches of your field. So say you were trying to pick 20 plants out of your field, and maybe there's a gradient where you've got better fertility going from this way to that way. If you just said, I'm going to pick the 20 best plants from my field, you might just pick them all from this patch. But it might be really useful to see which plants actually performed really well in slightly poorer conditions. So if you divide up your field into quadrants like this, and say I'm going to pick the best 5 from this patch, the best 5 from this patch, the best 5 from this patch, best 5 from this patch, you're going to be a little more likely to actually be finding the most genetically superior. So this is, So the question was, do you keep these separate at the end of the year, or do you just mix them all together? So simplest thing is just mix them all together and do it again next year. You grow out another patch, or the next time you do it, grow out another patch. However, what you can also do is take this to the next level and do it, instead of what we call mass selection, do this family or progeny selection. And so in this case, what you'd be doing is, instead of just bulking all the seed together at the end of the year, you'd be saving 20 different little bags of seed. So, here's, say that this is Nash Huber here going out through his kale patch, and he found his 50 best plants. He'd be saving those in 50 separate bags. Next year, as I mentioned before, what you'd be doing then for progeny selection is, rather than looking at individual plants, you're going to grow 20 or 50 separate little rows. Each of those rows being planted from a separate bag of seed that came from a separate bag of separate plant, the previous year or previous number of years, whenever you did your selection last time. And so, this just shows 3 rows, but imagine, there's 20 of these little, 10, 20 foot long, however long rows. What you're going to do now is, rather than just thinking about which plant is the best in the field, you're going to start looking and you're going to say, these are all related to each other. Which of these families looks the best? And one of the cool things you can do here is, because you've got lots of seed, you can actually plant a family in more than one place in your field. So rather than just planting this, planting 20 rows, you can actually plant 20 rows in one part of your field, and then those same 20 families get another 20 rows in the other part of the field. This is what's known as replication. And the idea there is, if something performs well in both places, you start to get a little more confidence that that really was a good family, and it wasn't just that it happened to be in the fertile corner of your field. So that's one thing that this idea of growing families allows you to do. The other thing that it allows you to do is, often what you're seeing is not all of the genes that might actually be in a plant are necessarily going to be expressed in a way that's noticeable to you. So, when we think about the kind of classic brown eye, blue eye type thing in people, many of us are, brown-eyed folks are carriers for blue-eyed genes. You can't see that. But if, I had, if I had 5 brothers and sisters, and you look and you say, well, some of the folks in my family have blue eyes. Well, it's very possible that, some of the brown-eyed folks are also carriers for blue eyes. What does that mean in plant breeding terms? In selection terms, it means that if you look at a family here, and this plant right here in the middle just looks like it kicks butt, but its relatives, its brother and sister plants all look really lousy, you might not want to save that plant that looks really good because it's sharing a lot of its genes with those not so good, with those inferior plants. And so what you want to do is you want to look at a family as a whole, and if you've got multiple replications, you'd look at it in 2 or 3, however many places you planted that family in the field, and you want to find something that, across the board, 80, 90% of those plants all look pretty darn good. And that's the one you want to save. And then you go through and all the ones that are inferior, that don't have lots of good plants in them, you are going to get rid of those and rogue them out. Yeah.
And that you would want to rogue before pollination.
Again, if at all possible, you're going to do better if you can remove the plants that you don't want pollen or seed from, if you can remove them before they pollinate. So if there's things that you're looking at that you can make selection on, remove them before they're pollinated. So once you've removed all the inferior families, you also want to go through the families that you're keeping and get rid of the plants that weren't the best within that family. So you're picking now the best individual plants from the best families. And this process will allow you can see it's a lot more intensive, but it can really allow you to speed up your selection efforts. And if you're, again, just looking at this from the idea that you're not doing this every year, that this is an opportunity for you to produce some good quality stock seed that can last you for a few years, it starts to become more worth it. So at that point, you can go ahead and do one of 2 things. You can continue this process where you now are saving seed from separate bags, saving seed from these individual plants in separate bags, or you can go ahead and either bulk within the families you liked, meaning, if you saved, you liked this family and you liked another family and you liked the 3rd and 4th family, you just have 1, 2, 3, 4 bags of seed. Or you can bulk it all back together again. It depends on how confident you are that you've got something really good, or how intensive you want to do your selection again the next year. I'm going to show you a quick example of all of this to hopefully help solidify a little bit. So this is Bill Reynolds here, farmer up in California, bred a zucchini, and he started out with a cross of Raven, which is a hybrid, by Black Beauty, which is an open pollinated. He grows on dry farms, and he needs plants that are very vigorous to be able to tap in and grow quickly in the spring, get down to good groundwater as it dries up in the summertime. He made this cross between Raven and Black Beauty and started doing mass selection. He grew on a decently large acreage, somewhere around 2 to 4 acres of zucchini a year, and would go through and flag individual plants, not necessarily taking stuff out before pollination because he was growing it for market and seed, and wasn't separating out his stock seed production from his regular seed production. But what he would do is he would go through that field and, out of thousands and thousands of plants, he would be picking, the best handful of plants and saving those now as his stock seed that he would use for planting next year. So he was doing mass selection, taking advantage of very large populations and improving it for that vigor that he cared about, but also for nice dark green fruits that were cylindrical and even, and had relatively few spines, had a good bushy habit, all the things.
Open plant habit
Yep.
for ease of picking.
Yep. So at the end of several years, he ended up with a variety that he was pretty happy with through this mass selection process. It had the dark green fruits. You could see it had some degree of variability still, however. And it still was showing some, every once in a while, he would still see some real off-type plants. He would see some yellow fruits. He would see some striped fruits. He would see some fruits that had more of this, or plants that had more of this runner-type habit instead of the bush-type habit that he wanted. And he said, gosh, how am I ever going to get rid of this stuff? It's so hard to get it out of my field. And part of the reason that it was so hard was that there's a certain limit to how far you're going to get with this mass selection. He was still, he couldn't necessarily go through a 4-acre field and get rid of every single plant that was an off-type. And they were still contributing pollen, even though he was picking really nice plants. That pollen was coming from everywhere. And there were some of these hidden genetics that might even be in the plants that he was picking that he couldn't see. So what he did was he worked with John Navazio with Organic Seed Alliance at the time, and John said, here's what I want you to do. When you go out this year and you pick out your very best plants, just like you've been doing every year, now instead of just putting a flag on it and saving seed at the end of the year, I want you to hand pollinate these. I want you to self-pollinate each of those plants. Zucchini, it's relatively easy to self-pollinate. You've got, nice big male flowers, nice big female flowers. And so he went through and would tape the female flowers before they opened, and then would apply the male pollen to it and then retape them so he knew only the pollen was coming from that, each plant. At the end of the year, he had 26 bags of seed that came from 26 self-pollinated plants. Next year, he was able to grow, this is him pollinating. Next year, he was able to grow 26 of these rows, of these family rows. So each row having come from one of those bags of seed, having come from a single plant the last year. And what he saw was that he saw all kinds of crazy things. He saw, some of these rows had lots and lots of runners. Some had, lots of these yellow fruits. And because he self-pollinated it, it actually expressed some more of these hidden genes that weren't always visible. And so at first he's like, oh no, what did I do? And John told him, this is actually perfect. This is just what you want to do. You're seeing things that you can't see as easily unless you do this self-pollination and grow out these family rows. So out of those 26, he ended up saying, okay, there's only 4 of these that I really like. Got rid of the rest, resetted the field like we talked about before, where he now took off all the fruits, took off all the flowers, and then let them repollinate and save the seed, bulking, as we say, within each of those families. So now he had 4 families that he liked. He ended up with 4 bags of seed. Grew those again the next year and said, actually, out of those 4 families, there's only 1 that really I liked. And so that was what then became the beginning of what he called Dark Star. And it ended up being a really excellent variety for a number of reasons. It was that all that effort that he had done in that mass selection process, selecting for vigor in his dry farming, produced things that had really good roots, that were very stress resistant. And then that final act of self-pollination and family selection was able to then refine the fruit and plant types to be much more uniform. So yeah, so what he did basically was that he invested, a couple of years in just doing this progeny selection. So he was not growing a large production field at that point. And so, and we've done, that's the last time that he's done the progeny selection, but I've worked with him since then, and what he's done is more or less every other year what he'll do is he'll alternate a larger field for production seed that he'll go through in rogue, but then a smaller field that he'll do for stock seed, still mass selection, but he'll go through then, and it's small enough that he can go through plant by plant and be very aggressive with removing all the plants that aren't perfect, and then do that process of resetting the field so that only the pollen is only coming from the good plants, and that's how what he's done for stock seed.
And one thing I'll say is that I presented this once and somebody asked me, aren't you going to suffer from inbreeding depression? Because he was only taking one progeny row at the very end. But if you look back at this, he started with a wide cross between two quite distinct varieties. So he already had built-in genetic diversity. And that's another thing we say. Intuitively, it's like, oh gosh, how can he select from such few plants?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things going on there. Yeah, first is he had maintained large populations for a long time, and then really just had this very brief bottleneck in the process, and so he still has some degree of genetic diversity that's happening there. Also, squash is much more tolerant of inbreeding than some of the other cross-pollinated crops. Yeah, so I will first say that myself and Aaron Silva are going to give a talk on breeding for climate change, I think on Friday, where we'll go into this in more depth, but there's a few different approaches that you can take. One is, you can look to be targeting specific, resistance to specific stresses. So you say, okay, we need to have something that's more drought tolerant or more flood tolerant or more, tolerant to these, new emerging pests and diseases that we expect are going to be moving in. So that's sort of more traditional breeding approach where you anticipate what's going to be happening and you do targeted breeding for that by saying, okay, we're going to, put this in a stress nursery that's, really dry or really, flooded. So that's one traditional approach. Another is you can try and select for something that is stable, and really the best way to do that is to actually test something in a big wide range of environments. That's hard to do on your own. It really helps to have a community where you can be able to send seed around to a bunch of different parts of the country to see, okay, does this thing do well in here and there and there and there? Well, now you have something that you can grow well in a pretty wide range of environments. But then the other piece of it is, okay, can we incorporate some degree of genetic diversity within this so that way you may have some of the plants that don't do all that great when it's dry out, but you've got a lot of them that do. And likewise, you may have some of your plants that don't do all that great when it's flooded, but you've got a lot of them that do. And that's a traditional method you see. I remember seeing a slide somewhere that that this Syrian barley grower, he grew his barley production. He basically grew a mix of 400 varieties, at the same time, with the idea that he was, by having this diversity in there, he was minimizing his risks. You see the same thing actually, in alfalfa. Alfalfa, is a crop that has to be very hardy and has to, pretty much just go out in the field and survive. And so generally alfalfa is sold as a relatively diverse thing because they know that, a lot of those seeds that get planted won't survive, but if you've got enough of a mix, the ones that do survive will fill in. So that strategy of just incorporating genetic diversity in there. It's harder in the vegetable world because the market demands are there. So you often have, so knowing, okay, how do we have as much genetic diversity as we can in terms of these traits that we care about, responding to environmental stresses, but have, the uniformity that's required by the market, finding that balance. Bill actually, this variety, if you see it growing in the field, you'll see there's still a fair degree of diversity in there. And he really did this selection for, vigor, for a really strong root system by selecting in his dry farming conditions that's turned out to be, have all these side benefits. He was able to, large grower down in Baja grew it, and it was his favorite variety because it would survive more through a light frost than any of the hybrids. It's done better, when it's been has some degree of disease pressure on it, just because it's got the vigor to bounce back from it. So there are certain traits that may be applicable to a wide range of stresses. All right. Thank you all so much for spending your day with us.